The galloping hooves of her pursuers echoed in the distance as Fiona Zachary scrambled up the treacherous cliff path, her wrists bound painfully behind her back. The year was 1876, and the once promising journey west had become a nightmare she never could have imagined when she'd left Boston 3 weeks earlier. Rain lashed against her face as she struggled higher, each step more perilous than the last. The hem of her once fine emerald dress was torn and mudded, catching on jagged rocks as she desperately sought refuge from the men who'd abducted her from the stagecoach. They'd taken everything: her money, her dignity, and now they wanted her life. She went this way. A gruff voice shouted from below. "The boss wants her dead by sundown." Fiona bit back a sob. The path ahead narrowed to barely a foot wide, with a sheer drop of at least 60 feet to the rocks below. The storm that had been brewing all day now unleashed its full fury, turning the dirt beneath her boots to treacherous mud. Lightning split the sky, illuminating her desperate situation in harsh white light. "Please, Lord," she whispered, pressing herself against the cliff face as wind threatened to pull her into the abyss. "I don't want to die out here." Another flash of lightning revealed a small outcropping about 20 feet higher, a ledge just large enough for her to hide on. With her hands bound, the climb would be nearly impossible, but she had no choice. The voices below grew louder. Using her shoulder against the rock wall for balance, Fiona inched upward. Her fingers, already bleeding from her earlier escape, scrabbled uselessly behind her back as she fought for purchase with her boots. One slip would mean certain death, yet staying put promised the same fate when her pursuers caught up. By some miracle, she reached the ledge, collapsing onto the small stone shelf just as the first of her pursuers came into view below. She pressed herself flat, praying the darkness and driving rain would shield her from their sight. Where'd she go? One man shouted over the howling wind. "Maybe she fell," another replied. "Can't see nothing in this damned storm. The boss ain't gonna like it if we don't bring back proof." Fiona held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they might hear it even over the storm. The men conferred below for several agonizing minutes before the first one spoke again. "We'll come back at first light. If she's alive, she ain't going nowhere in this weather with her hands tied." Their voices faded as they retreated down the path, leaving Fiona alone with the raging elements. The ledge offered minimal protection from the storm, and the temperature was dropping rapidly as night approached. Without use of her hands and trapped on this tiny shelf of rock, she faced a grim choice between freezing to death or falling to her death if she attempted to move. Thunder rolled across the New Mexico territory as Fiona pressed her back against the cliff wall, trying to work her bound wrists against a sharp edge of rock. The rope was thick and wet, barely fraying despite her efforts. After nearly an hour, her shoulders ached unbearably, and she'd made almost no progress. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her. The journey from Boston had already tested her limits, 23 days of hard travel to reach her uncle's ranch near Santa Fe, only to learn upon arrival in the territory that he'd died 2 months earlier. With nowhere to go and her funds dwindling, she'd taken a room at the boarding house in town, hoping to find employment. Instead, she'd found trouble in the form of Frederick Walton, a wealthy rancher who'd taken an unwelcome interest in her. When she'd rebuffed his advances, his anger had turned dangerous. She tried to leave town on yesterday's stagecoach, but Walton's men had been waiting. Now here she was, certain to die on this cliff if help didn't come soon. As darkness fell completely, the temperature plummeted further. Fiona's thin dress offered little protection against the biting wind and rain. Her teeth chattered uncontrollably as she huddled against the rock face, trying to preserve what little body heat remained. "I won't give up," she whispered to herself, though her voice was lost in the howling wind. "I didn't come all this way to die like this." Morning seemed an eternity away, and Fiona wasn't certain she'd survive to see it. The storm intensified, sheets of rain pouring over the cliff edge above her. She closed her eyes, trying to focus on anything but her desperate situation. Miles away, Tanner Sloan urged his weary horse forward through the raging storm. At 32, he'd weathered many such tempests during his years as a cattle driver, but tonight's ferocity tested even his experience. Lightning flashed constantly, illuminating the rugged landscape in brief, ghostly glimpses before plunging it back into darkness. "Come on, Blaze," he encouraged his chestnut stallion. "Just a few more miles to that line shack." Tanner had been on his way to Santa Fe when the storm hit, hoping to secure a position with one of the larger ranching operations before winter set in. After years of driving cattle north from Texas, his body ached for a more permanent arrangement. At his age, he was beginning to crave stability, something he hadn't known since before the war. The rain plastered his dark hair to his forehead beneath his wide-brimmed hat, which he tied securely under his chin to prevent the wind from claiming it. His oilskin coat offered some protection, but water still found its way in, running down his neck and soaking his shirt. Lightning struck a tree not 50 yards ahead, splitting it with a deafening crack. Blaze reared in terror, nearly unseating Tanner before he regained control of the panicked animal. "Easy, boy," he soothed, patting the horse's neck. "We've got to find shelter soon." As Blaze settled, Tanner peered through the downpour. They were skirting the edge of a deep ravine, following what passed for a trail in these parts. He knew there was an old line shack used by ranchers about 2 miles ahead, but in this weather, it might as well have been 20. Another flash of lightning revealed the trail ahead, and something that made Tanner lean forward in his saddle, squinting through the deluge. "What the devil?" he muttered. The lightning had briefly illuminated the cliff face across the ravine, and Tanner could have sworn he'd seen a figure huddled on a narrow ledge. He waited for the next flash, eyes trained on the spot. When it came, his suspicions were confirmed. Someone was trapped on that ledge, and from their stillness, they were either unconscious or— Tanner didn't complete the thought. Without hesitation, he turned Blaze toward the ravine, searching for a way across. The normally dry streambed below was now a churning torrent, impossible to ford. He'd have to find another approach. "Come on, Blaze," he urged, remembering a place about half a mile back where the ravine narrowed considerably. The journey felt interminable as Tanner battled the elements, but at last they reached the crossing point. Even here, the gap was nearly 15 feet, a formidable jump, especially in these conditions. "We've only got one shot at this, boy," Tanner said, backing Blaze up for a running start. "Don't let me down now." He spurred the horse forward, feeling the powerful muscles bunch beneath him as they galloped toward the edge. At the last possible moment, Blaze gathered himself and leapt. For one heart-stopping moment, they were airborne above the rushing water below. Then Blaze's hooves struck the opposite bank, scrabbling for purchase on the slick ground. For a terrifying second, they teetered on the edge before the stallion lunged forward, securing their position on solid ground. "Good boy," Tanner gasped, his heart pounding. "Best horse I ever had." Now to find that figure on the ledge. Tanner estimated they were about a quarter-mile from where he'd spotted the person. The terrain was treacherous, especially in the storm, but he pushed on, guided by occasional lightning flashes. Finally, he reached a point where the cliff face was visible. Another lightning strike confirmed his fears. Someone was indeed stranded on a narrow ledge about 40 feet up, and they weren't moving. "Hello," he called, his voice nearly lost in the howling wind. "Can you hear me?" Fiona's consciousness had retreated to a dreamlike state, her mind drifting between memories of her childhood in Boston and awareness of her dire predicament. The cold had become so intense that she barely felt it anymore, a dangerous sign she recognized from stories of winter travelers found frozen to death. Something pulled her back from the brink of voice, perhaps, or just her imagination. She forced her eyes open, seeing nothing but darkness and sheets of rain. Then she heard it again, faint but unmistakable. "Hello, is anyone up there?" With effort, Fiona shifted position, peering down through the darkness. "Help!" She tried to call, but her voice emerged as little more than a croak. She swallowed painfully and tried again. "Help me! I'm here!" A flash of lightning revealed a man on horseback below. For one terrifying moment, she feared her captors had returned, but this was a single rider, not the gang that had pursued her. "I'm coming up," the voice called. "Hold on." Tanner dismounted quickly, securing Blaze to a scrubby tree that somehow clung to the rocky soil. He shed his oilskin coat, it would only hinder his climb, and began searching for a route up the cliff face. The path Fiona had taken was visible, though barely, and Tanner started up it cautiously. Years of working cattle in rough country had made him sure-footed, but even he struggled against the combination of darkness, rain, and treacherous footing. "Keep talking so I can find you," he called up. "I'm here," Fiona responded, her voice stronger now that hope had rekindled. About 20 feet up from the path, Tanner followed her voice, moving carefully but quickly. When he finally reached the spot below her ledge, he could just make out her form in the darkness. "I'm going to climb up to you," he called. "Just stay still." The final ascent to her ledge was the most dangerous part. Without a rope, one mistake would send him plummeting to the rocks below. Tanner tested each handhold carefully before trusting it with his weight. At last, his head drew level with the ledge where Fiona huddled. In the next lightning flash, he saw her clearly for the first time, a young woman with hair the color of honey, though it was plastered to her head by the rain. Her dress was torn, and he could see that her hands were bound behind her back. "Madam," he said, pulling himself onto the narrow shelf beside her, "looks like you're in a mighty tight spot." "Thank God you found me," Fiona whispered, trembling violently from cold and relief. "I didn't think anyone would come." "Let's get those ropes off you first," Tanner said, drawing a knife from his boot. He carefully slipped the blade between her wrists and the rope, sawing through the thick fibers. "How long have you been out here?" "Since before sunset," she replied through chattering teeth. "There are men after me. They'll be back at dawn." As the ropes fell away, Fiona gasped in pain as blood rushed back into her numb hands. Tanner quickly sheathed his knife and rubbed her wrists gently, trying to restore circulation. "My name's Tanner Sloan," he said, keeping his voice calm despite the urgency of their situation. "I was heading for shelter when I spotted you." "Fiona Zachary," she managed. "I was on the stagecoach to Santa Fe when they attacked." "We need to get you warm and away from here before those men return," Tanner said. "Can you climb down if I help you?" Fiona nodded, though uncertainty showed in her eyes. "I'll try." "I'll go first," Tanner explained, "and guide your feet to each foothold. Just take it slow and steady." The descent was agonizing. Fiona's limbs were nearly frozen, making each movement painful and clumsy. Several times she slipped, saved only by Tanner's strong grip. When they finally reached the bottom, she collapsed against him, her strength completely spent. Without hesitation, Tanner lifted her into his arms and carried her to where Blaze waited. The horse snorted nervously at the unfamiliar burden, but stood steady as Tanner draped his oilskin coat around Fiona's shoulders. "I know a place about 2 miles from here," he said, mounting Blaze and pulling Fiona up to sit before him in the saddle. "A lined shack where we can get warm and dry." He wrapped one arm securely around her waist while holding the reins with the other and urged Blaze forward. Fiona leaned back against his chest, drawing warmth from his solid presence. "Why would anyone want to kill you?" Tanner asked as they rode, partly to keep her alert and partly from genuine curiosity. Through chattering teeth, Fiona explained about Frederick Walton and his unwanted attentions. "When I refused him, he became dangerous, said no woman had ever turned him down before and none ever would." "Some men can't handle being told no," Tanner commented grimly. "Especially men with money and power." The journey to the lined shack seemed endless, but at last, a small, sturdy cabin appeared through the rain. Tanner dismounted first, then lifted Fiona down. He led Blaze to the lean-to attached to the cabin, where the horse would have some protection from the elements. The cabin door was secured with a simple latch. Inside, it was basic but sound: a single room with a stone fireplace, a narrow cot against one wall, and a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs. A stack of firewood was piled beside the hearth, left by the last occupant. "Thank heavens," Tanner muttered, quickly setting about building a fire while Fiona stood shivering in the center of the room. Soon, flames crackled in the fireplace, casting a warm glow throughout the small space. Tanner found a threadbare blanket in a trunk and wrapped it around Fiona's shoulders in addition to his coat. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll step outside while you change into this." He handed her a clean, if somewhat worn, flannel shirt from his saddlebag. Fiona nodded gratefully, too exhausted and cold to feel embarrassment. When Tanner returned a few minutes later, she was sitting on the edge of the cot, his oversized shirt hanging to her knees, her wet dress and undergarments spread before the fire to dry. Tanner had also changed into dry clothes, and now he set about preparing a simple meal from the provisions in his saddlebag: jerky, hardtack, and coffee brewed in a small pot he'd found hanging beside the fireplace. "It's not much," he apologized as he handed her a tin cup of the steaming coffee. "But it'll warm you from the inside." "It's perfect," Fiona said, wrapping her still cold fingers around the cup. "I can't thank you enough for what you've done." Tanner shrugged, settling into one of the chairs. "Any decent man would have done the same." "Not many men would have spotted me in that storm, let alone risk their life climbing up a cliff in the dark," Fiona countered. As they ate their meager meal, they exchanged stories. Fiona told Tanner about growing up in Boston, the daughter of a successful merchant who'd lost everything in a financial panic 5 years earlier. After her parents died of influenza last winter, she decided to join her uncle in New Mexico, only to discover upon arrival that he'd passed away as well. "What about you?" she asked, color finally returning to her cheeks as warmth from the fire and food spread through her body. Tanner's life story was one of constant movement. Born in Missouri, he'd fought for the Union during the war, then drifted west afterward, unable to settle back into civilian life in his hometown. For the past decade, he'd worked as a cowhand driving cattle from Texas to Kansas, then west to the territories. "I'm getting too old for the trail drives," he admitted with a rueful smile that crinkled the corners of his blue eyes. "Thought I'd try to find a permanent position at one of the ranches near Santa Fe." As the night wore on, the storm gradually subsided, though rain continued to patter on the cabin roof. Fiona felt herself growing drowsy as the terror and cold of her ordeal gave way to exhaustion. "You should get some sleep," Tanner said, noticing her eyelids drooping. Take the cot, I'll keep watch. What about Walton's men? Fiona asked, suddenly remembering the threat. They said they'd be back at dawn. They'll be looking for you up on that cliff, Tanner assured her. Not out here. But even if they do come this way, I'll hear them long before they reach us. He patted the revolver holstered at his hip. Get some rest. We'll figure out what to do in the morning. Despite her concern, Fiona was asleep almost as soon as her head touched the folded blanket that served as a pillow. Tanner sat by the fire, occasionally adding another log to keep the flames going. He watched Fiona as she slept, struck by her courage and resilience. It had been a long time since Tanner had felt an immediate connection with anyone, man or woman. The cowboy's life was solitary by nature, with only brief periods of camaraderie during cattle drives or in saloons at trail's end. But something about Fiona Zachary stirred feelings he'd nearly forgotten he possessed. Dawn arrived with clearing skies, sunlight streaming through the cabin's single window. Fiona awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until her eyes fell on Tanner, who was cooking something in a small pan over the fire. "Good morning," he said, glancing up with a smile. "Found some beans and salt pork in the cupboard. Previous occupant left them behind." Fiona sat up, running her fingers through her tangled hair. "Have you been awake all night?" "Dozed a bit in the chair," Tanner admitted. "Nothing I'm not used to." After breakfast, they discussed their options. Fiona's dress was dry but badly torn and mudded. She put it on anyway, having no alternative. "We're about 15 miles from Santa Fe," Tanner said, "but going there might be dangerous if Walton has men watching for you." "I have nowhere else to go," Fiona confessed. "All my belongings were in my trunk on the stagecoach. I have no money, no family." Tanner considered this. "I know a rancher about 20 miles west of here, Jacob Miller. He's a good man. Might give me work and his wife could help you get on your feet. You do that for me?" Fiona asked, touched by his continuing kindness. "Seems the right thing to do," Tanner replied simply. "Besides, I can't just leave you to fend for yourself with Walton's men hunting you." They set out mid-morning, Fiona again riding in front of Tanner on Blaze. The air was fresh and clean after the storm, the desert landscape transformed by the rainfall. Wildflowers had already begun to unfurl their petals, dotting the normally barren ground with splashes of color. "It's beautiful," Fiona remarked, seeing the territory in daylight for the first time since her arrival by stagecoach. "So different from New England." "Takes some getting used to," Tanner agreed. "But there's something about this land that gets under your skin. The space, the freedom of it." They rode in companionable silence for a while, both aware of a growing connection between them but hesitant to acknowledge it. Fiona found herself acutely conscious of Tanner's arm around her waist, the solid strength of his chest against her back. Around midday, they stopped to rest in the shade of a large rock formation. As Tanner watered Blaze from his canteen, Fiona scanned the horizon. "Tanner," she said suddenly, her voice tense. "Riders coming." He joined her quickly, shading his eyes against the sun. 3 horsemen approached from the east, the direction of Santa Fe. "Could be anyone," he said, though his hand moved to rest on his revolver. "Or it could be Walton's men," Fiona whispered. "What do we do?" Tanner assessed their situation rapidly. They were visible here, but if they tried to flee, they'd be even more conspicuous on the open plain. Their best hope was that the riders would pass by without noticing them. "Stay calm," he advised. "If they're looking for you, running will just confirm it's you they want." As the riders drew closer, Tanner's expression darkened. The men were armed and riding hard, clearly searching for something or someone. They hadn't spotted Tanner and Fiona yet, but it was only a matter of time. "We need to move," Tanner decided. "There's a canyon about half a mile south. If we can reach it, We might lose them among the rock formations. They mounted Blaze quickly, keeping the rock outcropping between themselves and the approaching riders for as long as possible. When they finally broke cover, spurring Blaze toward the canyon, a shout went up behind them. "There she is! Get her!" Blaze responded to Tanner's urgency, galloping across the rough terrain toward the canyon entrance. The pursuers were gaining, however, their fresh horses outpacing Blaze, who had already traveled miles that morning. "They're going to catch us," Fiona said, fear evident in her voice. "Not if I can help it," Tanner replied grimly. They reached the canyon entrance just as the first shots rang out. Tanner felt Fiona flinch against him but kept Blaze moving, weaving between towering rock formations that provided some cover from their pursuers. The chase continued deeper into the canyon, which narrowed until barely wide enough for a horse to pass. Tanner knew they couldn't outrun the men forever. Blaze was tiring rapidly, but he hoped to find a defensible position. Rounding a bend, they came upon what looked like a dead end. But Tanner spotted a narrow crevice in the rock wall, just wide enough for a person to slip through. "Dismount quickly," he instructed, helping Fiona down. "Through there it might lead to somewhere we can hide." "What about you?" Fiona asked, clutching his arm. "I'll be right behind you," Tanner promised. "Go." Fiona squeezed through the crevice while Tanner slapped Blaze's flank, sending the horse galloping back the way they'd come. With luck, their pursuers would follow the horse, giving them time to escape. The crevice opened into a small hidden canyon, completely invisible from the main passage. Ancient cliff dwellings were carved into one-wall, remnants of people long vanished from this land. "Up there," Tanner pointed to one of the higher dwellings, accessible by handholds cut into the rock. "They won't find us easily." They climbed quickly, reaching the dwelling just as voices echoed from the main canyon. Inside, they found a single room, its ceiling blackened by ancient cooking fires, its walls adorned with faded pictographs. "What if they find the crevice?" Fiona whispered, peering anxiously through the small window-like opening. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens," Tanner replied, checking his revolver. He had 12 rounds, not enough if all 3 men found them, but better than nothing. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. The voices of their pursuers occasionally drifted to them, but no one discovered the hidden canyon. As afternoon stretched into evening, Tanner began to hope they might have given up. "I think they're gone," he said finally, after nearly an hour of silence. "But we should wait until dark to be sure." In the close confines of the ancient dwelling, their earlier awareness of each other intensified. Fiona sat beside Tanner, their shoulders touching, both drawing comfort from the contact. "Why are you helping me?" Fiona asked suddenly. "You don't even know me." Tanner was quiet for a moment, considering. At first, it was just the right thing to do. Anyone would help a person in trouble. He paused. "But now, I don't know. Something about you makes me want to keep you safe." Fiona's hand found his in the gathering darkness. "I'm glad it was you who found me on that cliff." When night fell, they cautiously made their way down from the dwelling. The canyon was silent except for the occasional cry of a night bird. At the crevice, Tanner went first, checking that the way was clear before signaling Fiona to follow. "Blaze is gone," he noted as they emerged into the main canyon. "Smart horse, he'll probably head back to that line shack where we stayed." "So we're on foot?" Fiona asked, apprehension clear in her voice. "For now," Tanner confirmed, "but we're only about 10 miles from the Miller Ranch. We can make it by morning if we walk through the night." The journey was arduous. Fiona's city-bred feet, clad only in thin boots designed for looks rather than function, were soon blistered and bleeding. Tanner fashioned makeshift bandages from strips of his own shirt, but her pain was evident with every step. "Let me carry you for a while," he offered after she stumbled for the third time. "I couldn't ask that of you," Fiona protested weakly. "You didn't ask," Tanner pointed out, scooping her into his arms before she could object further. "Besides, we'll move faster this way." He carried her for nearly an hour before setting her down to rest. As dawn approached, both were exhausted, but the outline of buildings on the horizon gave them renewed energy. "That's the Miller place," Tanner confirmed. "Not much further now." They reached the ranch just as the sun cleared the eastern mountains. Jacob Miller, a bear of a man with a thick gray beard, emerged from the barn as they approached, rifle at the ready until he recognized Tanner. "Sloan, what in tarnation are you doing here on foot with a lady no less?" Tanner quickly explained their situation while Miller's wife, Martha, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, fussed over Fiona's injured feet. "Frederick Walton, you say?" Miller growled when Tanner finished. "That snake's been trying to run every small rancher out of the territory. Been using hired guns to intimidate folks, but going after a woman." He spat disgustedly. That's a new low, even for him. Martha had already whisked Fiona away to get cleaned up and properly clothed, leaving Tanner and Jacob to talk. "I was hoping you might have worked for me," Tanner said. "And that Mrs. Miller might help Miss Zachary find a position somewhere safe." Jacob stroked his beard thoughtfully. "As it happens, I do need another hand. Lost 2 men last month to that silver strike up north." He eyed Tanner shrewdly. "But I suspect you're more interested in staying near that young lady than in my cattle." Tanner couldn't deny it. In the short time he'd known Fiona, she'd awakened feelings he'd long suppressed in his solitary existence. "She's special," he admitted. "Never met anyone like her." Miller nodded understandingly. "Martha was saying just last week how she wished she had help with the house and the accounts. Girl looks educated. Can she read and figure?" "Raised in Boston," Tanner confirmed. "I imagine she can." "Well then," Miller said, clapping Tanner on the shoulder, "seems we might have positions for both of you if you're interested." The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Tanner threw himself into ranch work, while Fiona proved herself invaluable to Martha, whose eyesight was failing, by managing the household accounts and correspondence. In the evenings, the four would often sit on the porch, sharing stories and watching the sun set behind the distant mountains. Tanner and Fiona grew closer with each passing day. Their shared ordeal had forged a bond between them that deepened as they came to know each other better. By the time summer arrived, their feelings were obvious to everyone at the ranch. "When are you going to ask that girl to marry you?" Jacob demanded one afternoon as he and Tanner mended fences on the north pasture. "Anyone can see you're in love with her." Tanner drove a post into the ground with more force than necessary. "What if she says no? She's educated, city-bred. I'm just a saddle tramp with nothing to offer." Jacob scoffed. "That girl looks at you like you hung the moon. Besides, you're not a saddle tramp anymore. You're my foreman now with a future ahead of you." It was true. In the months since their arrival, Tanner had proven himself so capable that Jacob had promoted him to foreman, with a substantial raise and a small cabin of his own on the property. That evening, Tanner found Fiona sitting alone on the porch swing, a book open on her lap. The setting sun gilded her honey-colored hair, reminding him of the first time he'd seen her, bedraggled and desperate on that cliff edge. "Mind if I join you?" he asked, suddenly nervous in a way he hadn't been even when facing Walton's men. Fiona smiled and patted the space beside her. "I was hoping you would." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as stars began to appear in the deepening blue sky. "I received a letter today," Fiona said finally, "from the territorial marshal." Tanner tensed. "About Walton," Fiona nodded. "They've arrested him." Apparently, one of his men turned on him, testified about everything including his orders to have me killed. He'll be going to prison for a long time. Relief washed over Tanner. The threat that had lingered in the background of their lives was finally gone. "That means you're free," he said softly. "Free to go anywhere, do anything you want." Fiona turned to face him, her expression serious. "I am where I want to be, Tanner." Their eyes met, and in that moment, all the feelings they'd cultivated over the past months were laid bare between them. "Fiona," Tanner began, taking her hand in his, "I never expected to find someone like you, especially not clinging to a cliff edge in the middle of a storm." This earned him a smile, encouraging him to continue. "But now that I have, I can't imagine my life without you. I know I'm not wealthy or educated, but I love you, and I promise to spend every day making you happy if you'll have me." Tears glistened in Fiona's eyes as she squeezed his hand. "I was alone and terrified that night, certain I was going to die. Then you appeared like something from a dream, risking your life to save a stranger." She touched his cheek gently. "How could I not fall in love with you?" Tanner pulled her into his arms, his heart soaring. Their first kiss was tender, a promise of all that lay ahead for them. The wedding took place that autumn, a simple ceremony in the miller's front yard with neighbors from miles around in attendance. Martha had helped Fiona sew a wedding dress from fine fabric, ordered specially from Santa Fe, and Tanner wore a new suit that made him look every inch the successful rancher he was becoming. As they spoke their vows beneath an arch of fall flowers, both remembered the storm that had brought them together, and the cliff edge where their story had begun. What had started as a desperate fight for survival had transformed into something neither had expected to find in the rugged New Mexico territory. A love strong enough to weather any storm. 5 years later, the Sloan Ranch flourished on land adjacent to the miller's property, purchased with savings from Tanner's years as foreman. Their home, a sturdy 2-story structure built with Tanner's own hands, rang with the laughter of their 2 young children and the occasional barking of Blaze Jr., offspring of the faithful horse that had carried them to safety on that fateful day. Fiona, now the teacher at the small school that served the scattered ranching families of the area, often told her students stories of courage and perseverance, though she saved the full tale of her cliff edge rescue for her family alone. Some stories, she believed, were too precious to share with just anyone. On the anniversary of their meeting, Tanner and Fiona would ride out alone to a special spot overlooking the ravine where he'd first spotted her. There, they would renew their private vows to each other, grateful for the storm that had nearly claimed her life, but instead had given them both a love neither had dared to dream possible in the wild and beautiful territory they now called home.